So without further ado, I would love to invite our speakers. They are, again, Mike Palladini and Tosha Comendant from the Land Trust of Napa County. And Mike and Tosha, just want to thank you again for all of the work that's gone into this presentation. And Mike, I'm so excited that we get to see and be treated to your fantastic photography and your storytelling. And so to the two of you, thank you again so much for all the preparation. And without further ado, Mike, I'd love to pass it over to you.
Sure. Well, yes, thank you so much. Thanks to Tom and Michaela and Together Bay Area. We do really appreciate the opportunity to share some of this information with you today. So again, my name is Mike Palladini. I'm the Stewardship Director at the Land Trust of Napa County. I've worked for the organization for about 13 years now, and fire has affected us in a big way. So I appreciate the opportunity to tell you a little bit again about some of the work we're doing around that. Tosha, do you want to do a quick intro?
Sure. It's great to see you all. Tasha Commandant. I'm the Stewardship Program Manager working with Mike. And again, just happy to get this information out and look forward to the questions and conversation. Thank you.
All right. Can everyone see the first slide, the intro slide? And is it in? Okay, great. It's in presentation mode. All right. Okay, well, thank you again. And I will just go ahead and jump right into it here. Just one more question. Did that slide forward? Okay, great. All right. So I'll just go ahead and start with a brief overview of our organization and our preserve system. The Land Trust of Napa County is a nonprofit land conservation and stewardship organization. We've been around for about 48 years. In that time, we've protected over 94,000 acres. That includes 26 protected natural areas that we own, totaling about 21,000 acres. They're the land shown in dark green on our conservation lands map here. But strikingly, about 90% of those preserved lands have burned in the last 10 years. Again, you can see those polygons indicating our preserve properties on this map. And then the recent wildfire overlay, that overlay only goes through 2021, but we haven't had significant fires in the last few years, so it is current or accurate. So our preserve lands started being impacted by fire in a significant way, sort of in that 2014-2015 period. Folks probably remember the big Lake County fires, like the Valley Fire. Those spilled over into Napa County and hit some of our preserves, like the Snell Peak Preserve shown here. And this is really when we started trying to get out and take a look at what these fires meant on the landscape ecologically in terms of our plant communities and wildlife, et cetera. And I'm just going to pause here for a minute and just mention, with a few labeled exceptions, I have taken all the photos in this presentation. And I just mentioned that, as Tom alluded to, again, only to say that I'm very excited to share these with you. It's been a big part of the way that I've sort of processed and documented what's gone on out on these lands after the fires. So the preserves that were hit sort of in those earlier years, 2014, 2015, are really dominated by serpentine substrate, serpentine soils, kind of that Lake Napa serpentine island, really a botanical wonderland because of that. Serpentine, many folks I'm sure here know, high in heavy metal content, low in the nutrients plants typically like to grow. That condition has really fueled plant adaptation, speciation, and now we have a whole suite of plant species that you only find on serpentine soils and nowhere else. Example here, Snell Peak Preserve, again, it's just a 254-acre preserve. Got out after the fires to start a botanical monitoring and pretty quickly documented 14 special status plant species in that small area. And it is essentially dominated by one plant community, type 2, serpentine chaparral or serpentine evergreen shrubland. Some really cool, rare species among those. Green jewel flower is one example. This is a strict serpentine endemic. It only occurs on serpentine soils. In fact, it kind of likes the harshest of the harsh. You find it on serpentine barrens and rocky ridge tops. And you can see that CalFlora range map on the inset there. Those blue dots indicate the only known occurrences of this species on the planet. It's restricted to northern Napa and southern Lake counties. It is listed on the California State Rare Plant Ranks as a 1B2. That's rare, threatened, or endangered in California and elsewhere. Another very rare plant we've been tracking pretty closely is Hall's Harmonia Hallii. This is another strict serpentine endemic, very similar range to that of the jewel flower, also listed as a 1B2. When our botanists discovered this plant or located this plant after those fires on the Snell Peak Reserve, it constituted only the second time this plant had been documented in Napa County in 40 years. We had a fairly significant population in 2016 as sort of a point in time reference, but we have actually been doing annual monitoring of the species every year since really the year after the fire. One interesting thing here is, we thought it was going to be a pretty solid fire obligate. I'll talk more about fire obligates down the line a little bit. We thought we were only going to see it for the first year or two following a fire or the fire, but it's really hung in there. The population in terms of numbers kind of peaked a few years ago, but it's actually still expanding its footprint. And then I just wanted to throw these photos in because it's one of my favorites. St. Helena fawn lily, rare plant, listed as a 4.2 plant of limited distribution. Just really gorgeous, and it literally covered acres in its patch size on these preserves post-fire. So really a beautiful one here. And then in 2017, we got hit pretty hard again. I don't need to tell anybody on this call, I'm sure, about the 2017 North Bay fires. Those fires burned entirely through 4 of our preserves, totaling about 3,300 acres. And we had a lot of this landscape out there afterward. This is our Foot Botanical Preserve on Mount George, northeast of the city of Napa, just about a month after the fires burned through. So caveat here is, we're a small nonprofit, we're a land trust, not a research entity, small staff, but we really did want to get out there and try to set up whatever monitoring we could to really try to track, again, sort of the ecological response of our plant communities and our wildlife to these fires. So that entailed lots of photo points across multiple preserves and plant community types. A small number of motion activated wildlife cameras set up on a time-lapse mode. Got out there and set up some replicated vegetation plots and transects related to general species richness and abundance, but also some of our rarest, most fire-dependent species. I'll talk about both of these in a few minutes. And then also set up some post-fire avian point count, continued post-fire avian point counts where we had avian point count transects established before the fires. I'll talk a little bit more about that work too. And then really just work with our botanists to get out there, kind of redo our botanical assessments, redo our botanical reports, and just sort of document what we had gained and lost as a result of these fires. On that last point, I just want to recognize this guy here, Jake Rugit of Napa Botanical Services. Jake is hands down the authority or expert or in Napa County flora. He actually wrote the flora of Napa County, and he has been absolutely instrumental and key in helping us document changes in our native plant communities over time, both before the fires and related to post-fire monitoring. We're also working with an outfit called Eco Ascension Research and Consulting to do some aerial monitoring. One thing we're doing in that regard are these orthogonal scans. These are pre-programmed repeatable drone flights through which you kind of end up with a composite image of many high-resolution individual images sort of stitched or seamed together. That photo at the top of this slide just that I labeled a little bit, just to sort of orient you to what you're looking at. You can see pretty high resolution individual bird manzanitas and some very new resprouts on these shrubs. Okay, start the water here. So in addition to the orthogonal scans, we got out there and also just sort of collected some general aerial videography to help tell the story of what some of this post-fire landscape looked like. And we did generate some, at least what I think is some pretty striking imagery. So I'd love to share just a minute of that with you now. Let's see if I can get the tech to work here. stop share.
All
right. Is the video playing for folks?
Yep, sure is.
Okay, great. So this is Mount George. Most of what you're seeing here is our Foot Botanical Preserve, which I mentioned before. See a really striking high severity fire in that chaparral. This is actually in the winter after the fire, so we had some rain. You might have seen some green in that first couple of seconds. But yeah, really pretty striking. So this is sort of southern end of the Napa range. You can see looking north that fire, the Atlas fire, in this case, burned out of the range and straight through into the valley floor. All right, so striking imagery there. All right, back to presentation and on video mode. I'm sorry, on presentation mode. Yes, okay, great. All right, so much of our post-fire monitoring after the 2017 fires focused on our chaparral systems or plant communities for a few different reasons. One is, as much as, if not more so than any other plant community type in our area, chaparral has been shaped by fire and more accurately patterns of fire. We have a lot of fire obligates in this plant community, the seeds of which require some stimulus from fire for germination, exposure to smoke or char or heat. We have a lot of rare taxa in our chaparral. And unlike many of our other plant communities, chaparral has largely remained native dominated. These are a couple of images you see here of pre-fire chaparral on our Foot Botanical Preserve. It's Mount George, what you just saw in the video. And I'll talk more about this preserve as we go. 1964 was the last time this had burned before 2017. So we're tracking a few general types of fire-adapted species. One are resprouters, or is a resprouting species. These are species that have the ability to resprout from surviving underground root systems or storage organs, even if all of the above ground portions of the plant have been destroyed by fire. There's an example here from our Sutro Preserve on Atlas Peak. It's an Eastwood manzanita, large root crown. You can see in just that 5 or so months after the fire, really vigorous resprouting, even though it had gotten hit pretty hard. And in the resprout photo, I see a few native perennial bunch grasses and forbs coming up there too, which is cool. I included this photo because I think it's just really the most striking example I've been able to document of the resilience of these resprouting species. This is on our Archer-Taylor Preserve and the southern end of the Mayacamas on the Sonoma County line. And, these were tough soils to begin with, Sonoma volcanics, very thin, poorly developed soils. And, the fires, I don't think did it any favors, but you can see still pushing up, and it made it. So it was really cool. And this, by the way, is chaparral pea, a really neat species. And this slide just speaks to the really amazing diversity of native resprouting species we have documented out there. So, lots of them. And the other general type of fire-adapted species we're tracking are obligate cedars. The larger photo you see here is of an area dominated by 2 species of obligate seeding manzanitas. This is, again, on our Foot Preserve, Stanford's and Hoary manzanita. Obligate cedars cannot resprout after a fire. They only come back from seed. It was often delayed, not a lot going on the first year with seedlings coming up, but in the end, by year 2, 3, for most of these species, these obligate seeding manzanitas and others, we were seeing really pretty good numbers of seedlings coming up. You might, just interestingly, a side note, might notice the sort of clumped or clustered nature of the seedlings in the inset photo. Not saying that's what's happening here, but there's been some interesting work by Tom Parker and others showing The importance of small mammal caching for the persistence of Arctostaphylos on the landscape, caching seeds where, they can survive the fire, they get the fire effects, and they can germinate after the fire. So interesting there. We're tracking a few categories of fire following species. First, we refer to as fire opportunists. These are species that are typically present in low numbers before a fire, but after the fire, they dramatically increase their numbers, flower prolifically, and very quickly contribute to the soil seed bank while conditions are good for that. A few examples here are Fremont star lily and golden fairy lanterns. We have some cool rare fire opportunists among those that we documented, like this Napa lomatium, list 1B2 again, and you can see smaller of the two photos, really just in some places formed almost a continuous ground cover where it was very sparse or even non-existent before the fires. That's on our Sutro Preserve. Again, Atlas Peak, so a really beautiful, rare fire opportunist, narrow-flowered California Brodea. It's also a list 1B2. It really thrived after the fire, where we had little to none of it before. A few other interesting stories in our fire opportunist realm. One related to our two carpal dwarf blacks, Hesperoline and Bicarpolatum. Again, a list 1B2 rare plant, thought to be a strict serpentine endemic, but we actually documented it coming up on volcanics after the fire. So interesting there. This is one of my favorites, tree poppy or bush poppy. We had one individual plant of the species that we knew about on our 760 acre foot preserve before the fires. I used to stop and show it to folks on field trips because it's the only one we knew about, and it's just a really cool plant. But after the fires, as you can see in this photo comparison, it became the dominant species over large areas. So pretty striking and an interesting story here. We also documented a few species that are, at least in our area, found to flower only after a fire, like the Sonoma rose, Rosa spithamia. Really cool. This plant was up vegetatively for many years before the fire with no flowers, and then just flowered prolifically after the fires. And again, a slide just sort of illustrating the really amazing diversity of fire opportunists that we had out of the landscape. Okay, the other primary or main type of fire following species we've been tracking are fire obligates. Our botanist Jake Rugit, who I mentioned, has now documented 44 fire obligates in Napa County. These are species that are absent from the landscape for a long period of time before the fires. Fire comes through and stimulates the seed to germinate in those ways that I mentioned before, prepares good conditions for seed germination and growth of those seedlings. And we typically only see these species for the first year or two after fire. Sorry about the ringing phone there. And then yeah, they're gone. So 34 annuals. These are mostly annuals we're talking about, but there is a handful of perennials and a few shrubs among them as well. One of the most interesting and exciting examples for me was this fire poppy here, the Pavor californicum. When this species came up on our foot preserve after the 2017 fires, it constituted only the third Napa County record for this plant. The first was either after a 1913 or a 1964 fire. The record was a little vague. And then second after a 1982 Atlas fire. But if you assume that the last time this species was seen on Mount George in our foot preserve was after the 1964 fire, probably just for the first year or two, that means it was in the seed bank for 53 years before it came up again. So really striking there. And then it was totally gone by year two. We had thousands of these in flower in year one, and then it disappeared very quickly, hopefully in the soil seed bank. Another interesting story related to a fire obligate is our Napa checker bloom. This is a very rare plant, list 1B1. It's restricted to the Napa ranges and southern Mayacamas ranges. The previous population in that Mount George foot preserve area that we knew about before the fires numbered in the 5 to 10 plant range. But after the fires, peaking in 2018, this species covered about 15 acres. And from some plots we set up, we estimate the population size at 680,000 plants. So really pretty amazing post-fire response there. And then again, by year 4, this plant had completely disappeared. We assume it's in the seed bank. Really beautiful flowers on this one. Interestingly, only came up vegetatively in year 1, no flowers in year 1, and then flowered abundantly in year 2, and then was gone by year 4 post-fire. Another really interesting story related to one of our most fire-dependent and rarest species, a shrub in this case, Napa ceanothus purpureus. This is, again, a rare plant list 1B2. In fact, we have the largest known population of the species on our foot preserve. This is both a fire obligate. The seeds require a heat pulse from fire for germination, and an obligate seeder doesn't resprout after a fire, only comes back from seed. And this is really indicative of what we were seeing in this population. The further we got out from that 1964 fire I mentioned, you can see sort of the last sad, sort of struggling, remaining living stems and leaves and flowers on this ceanothus purpureus, trying to make it, essentially being outcompeted by a dense overstory of manzanita, in this case, Arctostaphylos canescens. But just within really a few months, or the first few months after the 2017 fires, we started seeing this. It appears that the seeds got the fire effect they needed for germination, because we started seeing thousands of new Napa ceanothus plants coming up, seedlings. But the entire, this plant only covers, this plant's entire range is only 25 square miles, and that entire range burned. So we really wanted to get out there and do some survival monitoring around this plant. To that end, we set up 26 plots. There was about 500 plants contained within those plots across all the plots, and we have been tracking those annually every year since year 1 post-fire, 2018 to present. This is not, these are just some very sort of top-level descriptive stats or information. This is not related to any in-depth data analysis we've done, but we did track fruit production or reproduction for these plants as well in these plots. And interestingly, many of the plants were reproductive by year 3, producing flowers and fruits and seed. And as of 2023 sampling year, 54% of the total number of seedlings that we had documented in all of those plots were still alive, were surviving. So we think that, we talking with Jake, we really thought it could very well be quite a bit lower than that. So that actually we're pretty pleased and heartened by that rate of survival. And again, just a slide illustrating the really impressive diversity of native fire obligates that we documented out there after these fires. So I've talked a lot about some really heartening stories, positive stories around these very strong native plant responses or, recovery after these fires. It's not to say there's not serious threats to those native plant communities and populations. I know I'm probably preaching to the choir here on this one, but invasive exotic plant species pose a major threat. We saw many areas where invasion was exacerbated by the fires, whether it was came back heavier than it had been, or new invasions in new areas. This is a example here, good example here. This is me standing in just a sea of French broom. We had been working on removing it here, made significant progress toward that goal, but just like a lot of our native plants, it appears the fire had stimulated a seed bank to germinate, and it came back denser than we had ever seen it. Stinkwort, Detrichia is another one that just started popping up everywhere, but there's a whole host of invasives that seem to have also thrived after the fire. So it's definitely something to think about. Okay, switching gears a little bit, talking a bit about wildlife in this case. I mentioned avian point counts. We did continue point counts where we had them set up before fires on 2 preserves. We now have 7 and 4 consecutive years of post-fire data, respectively, for those 2 preserves. And I think, we're seeing a lot of interesting things, just taking a very cursory look at the data at this point. But I think one of the most interesting and exciting stories that we have found out of this work relates to this migratory songbird here, leisurely bunting. Really beautiful, beautiful bird. But on our foot preserve, we had no pre-fire records of this species. It became the most abundant breeding bird in the first 3 years post-fire. This is speculation, but we think it could be keying into abundant insect resources, foraging resources that themselves are keying into the abundant floral resources that I've been talking about that we saw after the fires out here, and these dense resprouting shrubs provide a good nesting substrate as well. So shrub nester. But by year 4, we were down to 1 bird on our point count transect, and years 5 through 7, which includes the 2024 count year, no detections. So in this case, it really does appear that leisurely buntings are essentially a fire follower. You do certainly find buntings in unburned areas too, but they seem to really key into these burned areas and to resources in those burned areas that are very abundant for kind of a finite amount of time after the fires. And when those resources diminish, the birds move on. Just a note here, we in this case have overlap between plant species richness and abundance transects and plots and our avifauna or avian point count transects. So we think it may be interesting and worth exploring possible relationships between changes in avian community composition and plant community structure and composition over time here. And I can't resist. This is one of my favorite photo plot comparisons photos. And I just wanted to point out this white flower you see in this big spray kind of rolling down a steep mountainside here is one of our fire opportunists. It's native morning glory, Solano morning glory. This is cool. And a similar story, but not exactly the same for avian point counts on our Rag Ridge preserves in southeastern Napa County. No pre-fire records for leisurely bunting there. We'd actually done 3 years of avian point counts immediately pre-fire there. It became the most abundant breeding bird. Now for the first 4 years, we still had 55 individuals on, I think, 33, 34 points on our point count transect just this last year, or this year, I should say. So they seem to be hanging in there. Not sure if it's a factor, but one major distinction between the foot preserve and the Rag Ridge preserve. Foot preserve is chaparral dominated. Rag Ridge preserve is oak woodland dominated. So interesting difference there. All right, some of you are probably familiar with the Wildlife Picture Index methodology for tracking, quantitatively tracking terrestrial mammal populations. We had a WPI project set up on our Dunn Wild Lake Preserve between Angwin and Robert Louis Stevenson State Park in northern Napa County. This is basically a 20 camera grid set up at 1 kilometer spacing. These are motion activated wildlife cameras. You basically turn the photos into data. You glean some metrics referred to as detection rates and occupancy estimates, which can be used kind of as a surrogate for abundance and allows us to sort of track the health of our terrestrial mammal populations over time. This entire project area and the large surrounding areas burned in 2020. I'll talk more about the 2020 fires in a few minutes. And we, after the fires, underwent a major grid redeployment effort. This was a monumental task. It's a very steep, rugged landscape, and to get the grid set up again was definitely an undertaking. And now we have 4 solid years of pre-fire data. We just finished processing a full 3 years of post-fire data. So we're now in a good position to, and actually in the process of getting all of that analyzed so that we can look at post-fire changes in terrestrial mammal abundance. We have a major California red-legged frog conservation recovery project in progress on our Rag Ridge Preserve. I just mentioned southeast Napa County. This entire project area preserve and again, large surrounding area burned shortly before the project started. So we added an element of, or an aspect of the project that entails both ground-based and aerial-based vegetation monitoring to, again, track changes in plant community structure and composition over time, and then really kind of translate that into a frog's eye view, if you will, really thinking about what that means for frogs, especially as they move through uplands for foraging and desiccation prevention and between wetland breeding sites. And then a few just sort of incidental wildlife sightings I just wanted to share with you because I think they're pretty cool. Kind of both ends of the spectrum, small and large. Banana slug in this, as you can see, very burned area. Would not have even expected to see banana slugs here even before the fires, arid chaparral on Mount George. But they had essentially survived the fire, came across this. They had survived the fire in this wet area, sort of the floor of this cave, and they were dispersing outward. And it was just really striking to see that. And then on the large end of the spectrum, this is my hand next to a very impressive black bear track. Very shortly after the Atlas fire burned through our Sutro Preserve, you can see the burned kind of leaf litter around it. But good to see, these large mammals had made it and were still moving through the landscape there as well. Okay, and then chronologically, sort of the next timestamp here in our fire saga is 2020. Really striking metric here. 42% of Napa County burned in a single wildfire season that year. This was primarily the Lake Napa Unit Lightning Complex and the glass fires. And as opposed to the 2017 fires, when we kind of got out to observe after the fires there, it became at least apparent to us that some of the most interesting ecological stories were probably going to be related to our chaparral. Getting out after the 2020 fires, we really thought some of the most interesting things we could look at were related to our oak woodlands, and this is largely why. It's not pretty. We had large areas of oak woodland that burned like this. This is a Google Earth image that was updated shortly after those fires on our Rag Ridge Preserve, where basically high severity stand replacing, every single oak in these stands was top killed. All the leaves, all the stems, everything from bottom to top was fire killed. This is a little while after the fires. You can see it's gone through kind of a growing season, but you can see those oaks burned, char all the way to the highest stems, no leaves. This is when even this deciduous species would have leaves. But oaks have an amazing ability to come back after fire. They can resprout basally, and they can also resprout from, basally from surviving underground root systems. They can also resprout from surviving buds on stems epicormically. What we're really talking about here in these stands is basal resprouting. These burned so hot that we, in our sample here, I'll talk about, we had virtually no resprouting from the branches or epicormically. So we got out and tagged 1,300 oak trees across 7 species, 5 sites, and 3 preserves to take a look at this. Specifically, what we wanted to look at was resprout survival by species, and ended up doing diameter classes as well. We really wanted to track initial and longer term survival. So kind of what proportion of the oaks in the sample initially resprouted, and of those that did initially resprout, how are those surviving over time? We're also collecting some height data to kind of get at growth rates. And this is really intended to help inform conservation and restoration efforts. Kind of both ends of the spectrum. On one end, we have a lot of concerns about, is this going to be an oak woodland again? How is this going to do? These tree forming oaks may not, don't form a soil seed bank. They may not produce another acorn for a long time. Large areas burned like this. So in terms of even animal dispersal from adjacent sites where mature trees survived, acorn producing trees survived, not sure about that. So, you got climate change in the mix, hotter, dry conditions, pests and pathogens. So lots of concern there. But on the other end of the spectrum, there's often a lot of energy and interest in kind of re-oaking and oak restoration after fires. And these oaks do really have an amazing ability to come back passively or on their own. So may not need that in all instances either. Couple examples of some vigorously resprouting oaks, black oak and coast live oak, in this case, on our Rag Ridge Preserve here. Just a note, just kind of a fun note, black oak has, I guess, won our height competition, our growth rate competition. In year 3, we had black oak resprouts as high as 6 meters, almost 20 feet. And that's just in the 3rd growing season post fire. So that's pretty vigorous. That's not what you're looking at in this one. This is a younger one, but yeah, pretty cool there. Just in terms, I mentioned 7 oaks in the sample. Those oaks are canyon live oak, interior live oak, black oak, coast live oak, scrub oak, valley oak, and blue oak. Just another photo showing you how these stands burned, but also them coming back a bit as well. This is from our Childs Preserve near the Cedar Ruffs Wilderness area in eastern Napa County. Certainly seeing some things affecting our, the survival of our resprouts, things like powdery mildew and rodent girdling. And we have particular concern about our blue oaks. This is just a snapshot here, but we had 212 blue oaks in the sample. I should mention, we started with 1,300 oaks. We did lose some. This was a monumental effort. Really hard to keep all these trees tagged and tracked every year. So we're still at close to 1,100 trees, but we lost a couple hundred along the way. But anyway, in the 212 oaks that are still in the sample, we only have 33 that are surviving as of year 3. That's a 15% survival rate. So, that's Tosha and I talked about it a little bit. It's like, is this when you start thinking about an management or stewardship intervention? I know there is generally a lot of concern about our blue oaks because they kind of tend to occupy those most arid sites, but they're kind of life on the edge anyway. But something to think about here. And then, I mentioned tree forming oaks. I still think probably aren't going to make acorns again for a long time. But we have this is a heartening story. This is actually an observation made by our field technician, Jojo Clark. For our one shrub forming oak, scrub oak, Quercus barburidifolia, Jojo found some of these shrubs forming acorns or producing acorns in just the 3rd year post fire. So that was cool. So in terms of kind of where we're at this point, our current step, data analysis, at least for those data sets with a more robust sampling design and better replication. Again, as I mentioned before, we are a land trust. We have limited internal capacity for getting data analyses completed. So partnerships have been and will continue to be key. And then these are all these were all kind of encompassed or encapsulated in the presentation. But I just wanted to recap some of our top questions at this point. I talked about looking at possible relationships between plant species richness and abundance, or plant structure and composition, and the composition of avian communities over time. Talked about the wildlife picture index data, looking at post-fire changes in terrestrial mammal species abundance. And then as an extension of that, related to possible future questions, looking at relationships between, again, habitat structure and composition and changes in terrestrial mammal abundance. We were already interested in the sort of the habitat variable in our WPI grid before the fires, because the Dunn Wildlife Preserve area has really striking fine scale habitat heterogeneity. We have a very complex mosaics of lots of distinct plant community types in this very complex mosaic of these small spatial scales with lots of mixing zones, et cetera. So we thought that already could be playing into mammal abundance, but looking at how those habitats changed after the fire and linking that to mammal abundance is something we'd like to do. And then I just talked about the oak survival monitoring and for those 7 species in oak woodlands that burned at a high fire severity. And then I mentioned the threats of invasion, talking about, again, invasive exotic plant species here, especially where those invasions were exacerbated or new invasions were established at least in part as a result of these fires. And with that, I just want to thank everyone very much for their time. Thanks again to Tom and Michaela and Together Bay Area. And yeah, really appreciate the opportunity. And I know we're going to have some discussion and breakout groups, but I'm happy to answer any questions folks have at this time as well. Tosha's here also to jump in.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mike. I think there's a lot of applauding going on muted Zoom squares. That was not only just some great flora and fauna storytelling, a rich story about how plants and animals responded to fire on the land trust preserves, but I dare say it's a tremendous value as an introduction to post-fire plant and animal recovery concepts and terms and techniques. That was a real post-fire life 101. Really opened my eyes to the different strategies that nature has developed with wildfire. The fire poppy hanging out in the seed bank for those many years. I don't know. The Midwest can keep the cicadas. We'll take the fire poppies. Shifting to questions. I'm really curious for you both, Mike and Tosha, of the monitoring that you've done. You presented a lot of different monitoring techniques. Photo points, plots, orthogonal scans, drone videos, the metrics, the tree metrics. What would you say for folks on the call has been the biggest bang for buck? What data? Maybe you haven't analyzed it yet, or what? But what data has netted the most sort of actionable information? What would you say?
It's a great question. Tosha, should I jump in, or you want to jump in there?
Yeah, go ahead.
I guess I would say, it's a little bit of an outstanding question, not to punt, but as I mentioned, we're just getting into the point where we really want to do something with a lot of this data. We've been in full collection mode, and now we actually have to.
I don't know. Did Mike freeze?
I believe so.
He'll be back.
You're on, Tasha.
Okay. Well, I mean, what came to mind quickly for me is, I think one of the most amazing reflections I've taken, kind of coming from a background over at Pepperwood, where we also experienced multiple fires and we're doing different types of monitoring, and then coming over here, one of the approaches I've seen here that is useful is just really kind of looking at like the very basic stuff you need. So this leads into saying, if you don't have a lot of time and energy getting out and setting up photo points right away so that you can really track those changes even visually, that will lead to, season changes that you might want to set up some hypotheses or develop some, future quantitative designs to address. But, just even if you can get out and do photo points that are repeated in the same place and direction and things, you can use it for storytelling, and you can start to use it for, measuring change over time.
Yeah, indeed. Mike, good to have you back.
Sorry about that. I got dropped somehow, so I apologize.
Not at all. Hey, actually, in the interest,
yeah,
Tasha was chimed in. In the interest of time, I actually want to bring the working group in to see if there are any questions for Mike and Tasha. Go ahead and it's actually a small group. Go ahead and take yourself off mute and just no need to raise hands.
Okay, I'll go.
All right, Tom.
Yeah. So, a flip on Tom's question: what data do you wish you had had?
It's a great question too. Tasha, yeah,
Well,
certainly
I'll
jump in.
jump in
Also
just
from
to
the
say,
and from the
yeah,
Pepperwood
right away,
perspective too. Yeah,
now I think of all the data we collect as pre-fire data. There's,
Mhm.
it's really hard to say what changed if you don't have both the before and after. It's such obviously a powerful way to look at it. We really focused here on showing sort of the biodiversity pieces of it. There's a lot of other things you might want to consider monitoring from a practical sense. There's fire that involve like erosion and infrastructure and things that
exactly.
fall out of the sphere of the biodiversity piece. Yeah. Mike, does anything
I
else
think,
come to mind
yeah, I
of
think that's
gaps
right.
that
More
we?
pre-fire data. We were fortunate to have some of those avian point counts transect set up, but certainly, and when we do, for some of our other monitoring, we like sort of the paired plot concept. So you're controlling for sources of variation. You have those really nice side-by-side comparisons over time. Such large areas burned here. We don't really have the unburned areas to compare it to in some cases, but yeah, I
But
think that's
also
right. Yeah, go ahead.
add, we are doing a lot of forest health work, fuels management, and having data that would show, sort of how, if we had those areas treated before and could compare it to how they compared. I know Pepperwood
Exactly.
can probably speak to that. There's some areas where we were looking into questions like that, but that knowing how much of a treatment to put in place before and after, the degree of it, and how effective that is would certainly be of use.
Mhm. Great. Other questions?
I was curious to hear seeing just an explosion in populations on your preserves after the fire, what this means, if anything, for introducing, good fire on the landscape and what the timing of that looks like. I'm sure it's species specific, but if that's now a part of your day-to-day thinking.
We definitely try to use prescribed fire as a tool for stewardship and management and restoration. Most of that has been, and yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, seeing the fire effects
Yeah.
that I just talked about, certainly gets one thinking about that. And, you can use other types of treatments where you don't get the fire effects and, so may not, they may not get you all the way there in terms of these really fire adapted species. Most of the prescribed fire we've done is focused around serpentine prairie restoration. And that's been an incredible tool for that, both in terms of controlling barb goat grass and some other really highly invasive grasses that can tolerate serpentine, and then also getting those fire effects for the natives in the system, stimulation of for seed germination, et cetera. So that's been a really wonderful story in terms of good fire. And yeah, you can't, you're absolutely right. You can't help but think about how to get, more fire effects out there using prescribed burning when you see the fire effects inherent in sort of these wildfires, even when they burned at high severity. So, Tasha, did you have anything to add there? I know you've been involved in a lot of prescribed burning also.
Yeah, it's really a great tool. It would be amazing to be able to bring it to other types of habitats where we haven't been able to use it and do it at smaller scales and from microburns and just different ways to use the tool. Currently we're rather stymied by sort of insurance and other practicalities around the expansion of it, but that hopefully may change over time.
Thank you both, Tasha and Mike, for those answers. Allison, thanks so much for that question. Such an excellent one. I just want to underscore the storytelling that we just were treated to. I don't think I've come across something that is more of a rationale, justification, visual piece to highlight the importance of fire. Mike, just what you said. There's a lot of different interventions out there, mechanical and otherwise, but the biological response that you've documented is it's a really strong signal, and you told that story really well. I have a feeling I'll be sharing this, the recording of your presentation to a lot of people
Thank you.
for that reason. Other questions from the working group? Thanks for those.
Yes, I wanted to share, I'm so impressed by what you were able to accomplish in a short period of time, you know, that really small window that occurs post-fire. And so my mind is a little bit blown, like, yeah, we're addressing sort of erosion issues, we're reaching out to our neighbors and making sure they're okay. And also you did just an incredible amount of data collection, and was curious if you had some of these protocols in place in advance so you're able to sort of deploy quickly, or if you just like got together and made it happen. Like, how can others replicate that amount of activity?
That's a great question, and yeah, very well articulated, because yes, and even in other kind of variations of this presentation, I start with all the other things. As you said, we were dealing with post-fire damaged and destroyed infrastructure and equipment, dealing with addressing concerns over catastrophic post-fire erosion. There was just figuring out, what we had lost in the fire. It was, and I know there are folks in this group who've gone through that too, but it was a lot on top. But I think what drove us, at least I'll speak for myself, is just too important of an opportunity to miss out on. So I, I and we really put a lot into it, as much as we could, because we just wanted to be able to tell that story and to really understand what was going on out here ecologically. And also with the human toll of these fires, we thought it could be in addition to sort of like the management, stewardship, and science implications, just being able to tell that sort of silver lining story. And we found folks have been very receptive to that, even folks who lost a lot in the fire. And really not that long after the fire, they were very happy to hear that, and a lot of folks look at these, some of those photos I showed immediately post-fire, things that look like moonscape. It's hard to picture anything ever looking good out there, like anything, beautiful or heartening or uplifting happening out there ever again. So, so it was a big undertaking in the midst of a lot of other just practical things we were dealing with, at a very fraught time. But what motivated me and our team, I think, is just, we knew from that ecological perspective, it was just too important of an opportunity to just say, oh yeah, we could try to do some monitoring, but we're busy with other stuff, and this is a crazy time, so forget it. So I mentioned Jake Rugit. He was really kind of he was such an important part of this. So you asked about what we had set up before, to have this incredibly knowledgeable botanist, who we were already working with, who already did most of our botany related work, who was also ready and willing to get out there. We did a lot of the establishing the transects plots, but he was ready to get out there the first spring post fire and, basically identify all plant material in every plot down to species and subspecies, that was huge. So, as you saw, we're pretty plan heavy on a lot of this. It was definitely a group effort, having some great biologists, scientists from outside our organization helping out too, and then just a very dedicated staff and just a real motivation to get out there. Yeah.
Right.
Try
like
to
to-
see what we could. Yeah, go ahead, Tosha.
I was
Yeah,
just going to
Tasha.
add, one of the things I found most useful going through similar experiences was just really reaching out to your network. Somebody has repaired a bulldozer line before and decided whether they should read seed or not and what trade-offs are. And it was one of those just moments to ask for help from people. And also when somebody else was going through it did feel good to like be able to try to pay that forward or just, approaches and stuff. So I would say, yeah, using networks like this one, and that's so valuable why we're participating in lots of pre-fire working groups now, so that
Yeah.
the relationships are built prior to having to kind of scramble and try to figure out what to do while you're frankly, often traumatized, and so is the community. So
Absolutely. And I reached out and got a lot of extremely helpful input from Pepperwood and Sonoma Land Trust and Sonoma Regional Parks. And it was sort of, I totally agree with Tosha. The network was big, and it really helped us and helped me reaching out to folks who were going through the same thing or had gone through it, and figuring out what they were doing and how they were addressing everything.
Well, I want to thank you, Mike, and you, Tosha, once again for a wonderful presentation, information filled. Thanks to the working group for the great questions.